Good afternoon, everybody. This is David Adams, and welcome to our SEL in the Series meeting webinar. I'm here with Michael Smith, and Michael Smith is the Executive Director of My Brother's Keeper and serves as the Director of the Youth Opportunity Programs at the Obama Foundation. I'm David Adams, Director of Social and Emotional Learning at the Urban Assembly. Our mission here at the Urban Assembly is to improve the social and emotional and economic outcomes for our students. We do that by being innovative within the context of public education. In our first SEL in the community series, we're going to talk to leaders in the community who are advancing social and emotional development of our youth. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by Michael Smith. Michael serves as the Director of Youth Opportunity Programs and Executive Director of My Brother's Keeper Alliance at the Obama Foundation. The My Brother's Keepers Alliance leads a national call to action to build safe and supportive communities for boys and young men of color, where they are valued and have clear opportunities clear pathways to opportunity. Michael was part of the team that designed and launched the My Brother's Keepers initiative and was appointed Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of Cabinet Affairs for My Brother's Keeper, managing the initiative and the interagency task force at the White House. Michael, prior to joining the White House, you were the Director of Social Innovation Fund, Senior Vice President of Social Innovation at the Case Foundation, and you helped build national initiatives aimed at bridging the digital divide. You're an Atlantic Institute Racial Equity Senior Fellow and a member of the Boys and Girls Club and Alumni's Hall of Fame, the highest honor bestowed on the organization. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you. So before we get into this, I'm going to introduce some Zoom features for our audience members, and then we're going to get right into this conversation around social and emotional learning in the community. Welcome to our Zoom members. Welcome to those who are seeing us on social media. If you're on Zoom, I want you to learn how to use the chat systems and the question and answers by, in the chat, answering this question. Where are you from? What's your position? And what are you looking to learn here today? So if you guys can take about 1 second in the chat, make sure that we understand how to use this chat feature, and then we're going to get into the question and answering. All right, so we see Pennsylvania's in the house. See, New Jersey's in the house, Virginia is in the house. We have teachers, we have professors, Utah, Bronx again, North Carolina, Boston, Alabama, Phoenix, Arizona, Philadelphia's in the house, New Jersey, Ohio, Baltimore, Ellen Connors from New York, welcome Ellen. Detroit, Executive Director of Becoming a Man from Boston, NYC. Take about 10 more seconds, get it all in. Josh Barbaro from the Urban Assembly. We got Chicago up in the house today. The Bronx is represented with 4 or 5 different people, and Arkansas. All right. We also have partnership with children in New York City and our founder, Richard Kahn, in the house. So thank you all for coming in together today. We are looking forward to this conversation around social and emotional learning in the community. And we're excited to be speaking here to Michael Brown. Now, Michael, the Boys and Girls Club Hall of Fame is quite the achievement. Now, I went to Boys and Girls Club as a kid, and I know a lot of people who did a lot of things, but I've never met somebody who was in the Hall of Fame. Can you tell me a little bit about what you've done to be honored in such a way?
I'm not sure. It was one of those weird things where I felt like I was getting a Lifetime Achievement Award in my 30s. So it was kind of surreal. That year, it was a really incredible slate. We had Victor Cruz, we had Nick Cannon. That was one of the folks that was there. We had.
Was he wearing the do-rag?
No, he didn't wear the do-rag. But it was an amazing class. You know, I grew up in the Family Center Boys and Girls Club in Springfield, Massachusetts. My parents were both 16 years old when I was born. We didn't have a whole lot of money. We had a whole lot of love, but the Boys and Girls Club really filled that gap for me, and it became a home away from home. It became the place where I had my first job. It became a place where I had a whole lot of extra people that loved me and looked out for me.
Yeah.
And so I made it a priority, whatever job I had, whatever opportunity I had, to make sure that I gave back to the folks like all of you, like all the educators that are on the line. Some of you who are working full-time jobs in schools and then go and work at the Boys and Girls Clubs or places like them. And so, I've had an opportunity, whether it was digital divide work we've done to help outfit hundreds of Boys and Girls Clubs with technology centers, or, working on lots of other different initiatives. So Boys and Girls Clubs is always close to my heart, and it was a true honor to be a part of the Alumni Hall of Fame.
Well, it seems like they feel the same way about you, and thank you for what you've done in terms of giving back to our community. Speaking about community, tell us a little bit about My Brother's Keeper and your work in the community. We're very interested in understanding what role My Brother's Keeper has done in supporting social and emotional development of our young people.
Yeah, sure. So My Brother's Keeper actually has its root in the horrific killing of Trayvon Martin, and probably even more so in the verdict that came out, where I think the entire nation was shocked, not only by the killing, but that someone could get off. And at that time, President Obama was really worried about what message that sent to young men of color in this country. And some of you may remember he surprised the press briefing corps one day in the summer of 2013 and really tried to give voice to what Black and brown mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters were feeling at that time. Sadly, we've had way too many other incidents like that afterwards and way too many before. But it was during that press briefing where President Obama said, 35 years ago, Trayvon could have been me. He said, Trayvon could have been my son. And he said, there has to be more that we can do to make sure young men of color in this country know that their country cares about them and is willing to invest in them, and we have to do something about it. So fast forward 6 months and later, in the East Room of the White House, February of 2014, the president signed a presidential memorandum directing the federal government to do everything within its power to reduce the barriers that stand in the way of young men of color achieving their dreams and to expand opportunity. He didn't want to have a kumbaya moment. He didn't want to have a rally. He didn't want to, have a volunteer day. But he said this is going to be anchored in evidence. And so the work was anchored in the social genome model, anchored in the work that Arnold Chandler and Tia Martinez did on the life course framework, knowing that there are these 6 key milestones from the ages of 0 to 24 that we need to have successful handoffs at each one of these areas to make sure that our young men can successfully enter the middle class. And entering school ready to learn was our first one. And I'm actually looking at the actual report right now. And entering school ready to learn, the sub-bullet was all children should have a healthy start and enter school ready, cognitively, physically, socially, and emotionally. And there are several recommendations in our founding report to the federal government on policy initiatives that they would carry forward, and also to cities who took on this challenge as well, to really look at the specific issues of SEL and how we think about how education, employment, trauma, violence, mental wellness, and the after effects of hundreds of years of slavery and institutional racism and Jim Crow and redlining, what that has done to our kids, and making sure that we think about those connections. So if we're going to heal young people, if we want our young people to be successful, we have to think about them as the whole. And we can't just think about a great program here and there without thinking about their social and emotional well-being.
Now Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X preached economic independence, right? So some of us really focus on this notion of ensuring that we're economically independent and effective. Now, other of us, like W.B. Du Bois, talked about ensuring that our intellectual status was one that we could compete with anybody in the country or the world. My Brother's Keeper is focused on this notion of mentorship. Tell me more about why mentorship was the key lever for supporting Black and brown kids in this country.
David, that's a really interesting question, and I'm glad you asked me, because I want everyone to know My Brother's Keeper is not solely focused on mentorship. One of my pet peeves over the years, having been a part of this since before it was created, was I'll see a headline that says My Brother's Keeper, President Obama's mentorship for Black boys, and I'm like, oh, you didn't read the press release. My Brother's Keeper was about, reducing barriers, expanding opportunities to make sure boys and young men of color and all children can reach their full potential. And we looked at the 6 key milestones. So working at we had 22 federal agencies and White House offices and the government that were working on everything from entering school ready to learn to third grade reading to high school dropout rates to keep getting our kids into college and staying into college to successfully entering the workforce to reducing violence and providing second chances. Mentoring was a cross-cutting milestone that we called it because the data on mentoring shows that no matter who you are, if you are a rich kid growing up in the suburbs, or if you're a kid that doesn't have a whole lot of means growing up in an inner city, the social capital that mentoring brings is incredibly important. The work that Ross Chetty did that actually showed that if you were a Black man who, grew up doing everything right, growing up in a great household that gave you all the resources, and you were standing next to a white man who grew up in a household that maybe didn't have any resources and you made some mistakes, that white man would still be more better off. But one of the things that it showed that no matter who you are, mentoring is one of those really kind of truly important solutions. But that is not the whole. We know you cannot mentor your way out of systemic racism. And so mentoring is important. Also, mentoring is something that anybody can do. When you're looking to start, you might not be able to create a citywide plan on how you're going to reduce barriers and expand opportunities. You may not be able to, start a new program that is going to help young people get in college and stay college. But anybody, whether you are 15 years old or 50 years old or 85 years old, you can figure out how you can look back and give back. And I think the other thing that is important to know, and what we focused on in this new phase of our work as My Brother's Keeper, is not just a call for more mentors, but really looking at mentoring programs that have real evidence of impact across the 6 key milestones. Just taking a kid to play baseball and having a bite to eat once a year, that's not going to do anything. Actually, we found some mentoring programs can cause harm if you're running in and out of the life of a child. But we've seen some incredible mentoring programs like Reading Partners help with third grade reading. We've seen Arches program, Incredible Messengers, help with reducing recidivism. The same you could see in high school graduation rates with some of the stuff that's happening, for instance, like with City Year and the near peer mentoring model. So that is a focus of ours, but we know it's not the sole focus.
It's amazing you say that, because the power of mentorship and the power of relationships has been something that our community has been founded in for a long time. So can you tell me a little bit about the strengths of the Black and Brown community in the United States and how My Brother's Keeper channels those strengths to support our young men in terms of development?
I mean, my goodness, have you ever seen a community that has been so brutalized, so victimized, put aside, marginalized for hundreds of years? For hundreds of years, we just saw the Pulitzer Prize winning 1619 project.
We sure did, yes.
For hundreds of years, have you ever seen a community so resilient, so willing to think about the idea of being in community, so willing to bring others in, to look back? I think about my community. Where I grew up in a community where people didn't have a whole lot of resources, working class community, growing up in the 80s, the crack epidemic came in with the economic downturn. People were struggling at times, but whether it were my aunts or my uncles or people at my boys and girls clubs or my next door neighbors, they poured everything they had into me, will give you their last. And so I see a community that is not only willing to create a strong village that loves and lifts up and protects our children, that gives. We actually see the donation rates in poor communities and Black and Brown communities is actually higher per capita than you see in other communities. Right. It's extraordinary to watch. And not only taking care of one another, but having then been on the front lines of the movement to make sure that America lives up to its ideals and really helping America to discover what it meant by democracy in the first place. And so, on the front lines in the middle of the storm, my grandmother worked at a factory, 12-hour shifts, and would still then be out there making sure that she was fighting for her kids and her community. And so those are the things that we can tap into. And we've got to reject the notions that, parents don't show up, or, we've got to show up for the parents. And we've got to make sure that we're making ways to make it easier for are communities that have it harder, and we're seeing those effects during COVID-19. What those effects are. But what an incredible community, what a rich community to grow up in, and what a great community we all should be tapping into to really continue to make waves for our children.
And you raised some incredible points, right? Of the resilience of our community moving into the civil rights movement and before. This notion of the Black and Brown community in the United States really pushing America to live its true promise. And we're struggling with that right now, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic where we're struggling to see, I think, the community that we need to develop ourselves. We have folks who are pushing for situations to be locked down, to end. We have folks who are sitting on their couch and thinking this is the hardest thing they've ever had to do in their life. What role does the concept that My Brother's Keeper supports, what role does that play in supporting our nation and our communities in the context of COVID-19?
Well, it's really interesting. So today, My Brother's Keeper is an initiative of the Obama Foundation. We no longer have 22 federal agencies and White House offices that we're working with as a federal initiative, but we're an independent nonprofit organization. And what we decided to focus on in this chapter is really working with communities around the country on the work that's taking place at the local level. New York State, for instance, was the first state to become an MBK state and fund the work from a state level that's actually based in school systems. So shout out to the New York State Board of Regents and Dr. Lester Young and Dr. Anel Alston and the incredible work that they're doing there. And so we are working on supporting those communities, whether it's the state-based efforts that are happening or it's local MBK communities in 250 communities across the country, or some of the regional efforts that are taking place. We also ran a grant competition where we selected 19 organizations across the country and 15 different communities that we thought really could be the models for the nation. And these organizations are working on youth violence prevention, second chances, expanding evidence-based mentoring programs, while also leading citywide initiatives to make sure there are clear pathways to opportunity for our boys and young men of color. So we're working with them, and every day they are doing the work to fill the gap and stand in the gap for our young people. And when COVID-19 hit, we all got very nervous, and we were worried about, would programs have to shut down? Would they still be able to fundraise? Would staff have to go home and take care of their families and stop the programs? And what did we see? We saw organizations like New Life Centers in Chicagoland who are still doing frontline violence prevention work and street outreach work and serving 400 meals a week. Wow. We saw Black Family Development Inc. in Detroit, who is still doing their work on restorative justice, still doing their work on their mentoring programs, and also providing food, providing video game consoles, checking in with their young people every day. We see organizations like Becoming a Man in Boston and Chicago that do these incredible school-based programs working on cognitive behavioral therapy and mentoring. And they said, you know what? We can't meet in a circle together, but we're still going to do our BAM circles over Zoom. We're still going to check in with our young people every day. And so I guess I shouldn't be surprised that I watch these organizations step up and do even more than what they were doing before.
Yeah, I mean, it's just amazing to see how different people react to stress, right? There's some of us who turn inward, and there's some of us who turn outward. And it seems to me just the legacy so far of My Brother's Keeper has been that inspiration of creating that beloved community that Dr. Martin Luther King talked about so much. I feel like we have choices as a society, as a nation. One is kind of fighting or kind of creating conflict. And one is trying to come up with the notion of community. The work we do around social and emotional learning, one of the things that we focus on is this notion of teaching our young people how to see themselves as part of a community. We build things called social contracts, or things like classroom charters, where young people get together and they argue about, how should you resolve disagreements? How do I want to be treated? What should happen when I'm not treated that way? What templates do you see for this kind of work in the larger space in terms of how we can think about community in our neighborhoods? What role can these concepts of social and emotional development play in helping our communities to resolve conflicts in a more constructive context?
Yeah, I mean, look, My Brother's Keeper is 6 years old, and so we certainly didn't create this idea, and we didn't create this concept. What we tried to do is shine a light on where it was working. We tried to hopefully bring some more evidence-based practice. We tried to hopefully connect more resources. We tried to connect sectors. So oftentimes this would have been the work of a lone educator or a lone nonprofit organizer, but now it's being led out of mayor's offices in partnership with city leaders and youth leaders. And so there are models all across the country where folks are coming together. I encourage people to look at our website at obama.org/MBKA to look at some of the examples where this is working really well. Whether it's in communities like Sacramento, or I was just on a call this morning with the team in San Francisco and Oakland and Houston, where communities are drawing on their history, but also drawing on what we know of modern collective impact theory and how that works, and a focus on data, a focus on collective measurement, and a focus on results coming together. And so I encourage people to take a look, and there are lots of models. And one of the things that we did that I think was very important with our My Brother's Keeper Community Challenge is there were 4 steps that all communities had to take to become a My Brother's Keeper community. One, they had to take the challenge and appoint someone to be in charge of it. 2, they had to do a really serious scrubbing of what was working and what wasn't in their communities for young men of color. 3rd, they had to have an action summit where they brought together the community and had honest conversations about those findings and begin to develop recommendations. And 4, they had to put together an action plan where they literally said, here are the disparities, and here are the ways that we're going to tackle them and who's going to be responsible for it. And so we saw these plans coming together that are constantly being involved and iterated on. And now that's becoming the anchor of the work in communities across the country.
Mike, I mean, you seem to turn out pretty well, man. You're well-spoken. You've been in Obama White House. You see what I did there, right? So who are some people who mentored you? Who are the people who invested in you in your life? And who do you want to shout out in terms of how you come to be who you are today?
Yeah, my goodness. I mean, I mentioned that I grew up in a working class neighborhood and we were poor. There were times we were on welfare. There were times where the heat wasn't on or the lights weren't on. My mother and I have this argument. She's like, you think you had it bad. Let me tell you how I had it. And then my grandmother will come in and let me tell you how I had it. We barely had floors in the house. So
there you go.
I was like, all right, you win.
My mother is from Haiti, so she usually wins this argument. But I give her a run for it.
You know how that argument goes.
I sure do, yeah.
Like, boy, you never missed a meal. Be quiet. I was like, that's fine. You're absolutely right. And so while, we were growing up under some tough circumstances, I was just showered by love, starting with a 16-year-old teen mom. I could not be the parent today that my mother was at 16 years old, where she just determined in her mind that her child was going to have every opportunity that she didn't have. Yeah. I stayed with my aunt while she finished high school. Yeah. My mother then enrolled into college, and she tells me the story where she took 6 buses a day in order to get me to daycare, herself to school and back. She struggled for 10 years and finally got her bachelor's degree when I was 10 years old. And so I got to watch that. I watched my father, who was a knucklehead teenager, probably not at the same place as my mother, but I watched that man work hard, mopping floors at the local hospital system. Now he's an executive at that hospital system. Wow. My grandmother, who worked 12-hour shifts at a factory and then was there to babysit me. Then I had, the Miss Carol at the Boys and Girls Club and Mr. Dawson, who were waiting for me when I got off the bus. Mama Morgan, who taught me how to cook at the Boys and Girls Club.
No, she didn't. What's your best dish?
Oh my goodness, we don't have time. I made a flayed lemon chicken last night. We'll talk about that where you cut out. All right.
I won't subject our audience to that.
But yeah, so many. And then my church community. I grew up in the Pentecostal church. For anyone who knows that, we were in church all the time. Multiple days a week, and I had a whole other set of parents and family members that were there for me. And then as we're talking to educators, I think about I was in a busing program, which was not always easy, where they sent the little black kids to the schools in the suburbs, the Metco program in Massachusetts. Ups and downs, but a whole other conversation. But I think about Mrs. Walsh, who was my 8th grade guidance counselor, who would stay after school with me when I was a student leader and drive me home. I don't know if she was legally allowed to drive me home, so sorry if I'm blowing up your spot, Mrs. Walsh. But she got me all the way back. Yeah. And so I just think about people who now as an adult, when I think about how much goes into your day, people who have their own lives, their own kids, who said, you know what, I'm going to take a little extra time because I believe that our neighbor's child has to be our child. And that's what My Brother's Keeper is all about. And I benefited from My Brother's Keeper before we had anything called that.
I was on a radio show, Don Nelson radio show down in DC a little while back, and he was asking me, when he grew up, he said that we all wrapped our arms around every child in the neighborhood, and something has shifted there. I don't know what it is, and he asked me to explain, what's changed, David, and I couldn't answer that. So I'm going to put this up to you, Michael, to think about what our communities used to think about this notion of every child being our child, right? If I corrected your child, it wasn't because I wanted you to look bad. It's because I just assumed that, you were doing something else and I'm looking out for your young people. But we've lost some of that. Can you tell me what your thoughts are on how we get back to a place where we're all looking out for a sense of community?
Yeah, I don't want to get myself in trouble by talking about yesteryear, but because it wasn't all perfect then either, right?
I hear you. I really do.
But I grew up in a poor neighborhood where we knew all of our neighbors, and I at times was a latchkey kid, and I can knock on the door of any one of our neighbors, and I know that that's just not true anymore. And that's not just not true for kids growing up in underserved communities. That's true in all communities. Yeah. That said, I travel all over this country when we could travel. And I still see that same spirit. I still see that the neighbors coming together. In some ways, I see it more in underserved communities than I see it in middle class communities. Right. People really looking out. There's, the lady who might not be working during the day that takes care of the kids so someone else can go work. The family that doesn't have enough food, but all of a sudden there's a bag of food that's dropped off on the doorstep. So, things have changed. Technology's changed us. The working world has changed us. Consumerism has changed us. Social media, which was supposed to bring us closer together. Right. I love social media. I think, the data is showing it's creating more echo chambers and bringing us further apart. And so I think mental health issues. I think we've got to create some new norms around what is still a relatively young, technology. I think about the beginning of the Obama administration, and I think the data said they were the White House operations folks were supporting about 10 BlackBerries when Obama became president. So when you just think about that was 2009, wow. And how far we've come. So we still have an opportunity to create some norms and create some changes. And I think you're even seeing the younger generation create some pushback on the way that they want to engage.
Yeah, I mean, I think what resonates with me when we have this conversation is this idea of trust. And what I think My Brother's Keeper so clearly represents is this notion of how we build trust, as you said, across sectors, but between people, between mentors and mentees, between communities. And that notion of trust, I think, is something that we're going to revisit in the context of what it takes to take a child who struggles to a child who's contributing to their community and who is social and emotionally kind of effective. And so we in the education system, we've spent a lot of effort thinking about what social and emotional learning looks like. Over the past maybe 5 to 10 years, social and emotional learning has gone from something that teachers maybe think about in secret, where they're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to teach you guys how to make good decisions, or, I'm going to teach you guys how to solve problems. Teachers, like I think who inspired you, who stayed after and wanted to really think about the whole child. To now where it's becoming a more standardized opportunity. There's more kind of institutional supports for it. But the education system has struggled to make links to the community-based organizations who are also investing in our youth social and emotional development. What are some thoughts about recommendations of how our education system, K-12 as a whole, can interact more effectively with community-based organizations to promote social and emotional development?
Yeah, we're seeing some good models, but first I want to say, I have educators in my family and friend group, and, I just have so much gratitude and thanks and praise for the educators and what they put in, and all of the things that they are being in the lives of our children, in contexts that are sometimes harder and harder with each passing year. I know the late hours that educators work. I know the going into your own personal wallets and purses. And so, thinking about, and another thing, I don't want to, oversimplify it. That said, I've seen over the years some really great partnerships that are happening, with organizations like communities and schools, where you are seeing, or even Boys and Girls Clubs, where the Boys and Girls Club is operating out of the school gym. And it's teachers that's the part-time job that they're doing there, or you're seeing, educators that are working as tutors within some of the systems, and leveraging the after-school programs or the community-centered programs for their volunteers, their resources, their computer labs, to make up for what they might not be able to do otherwise. And so, it is certainly happening. I think, organizations like communities, schools, and Boys and Girls Clubs and Ys have become really good facilitators of it. And I just say, look at some of those models that are out there. But the concept that it takes a village it's still a very real concept, and educators can't do it all alone. And there is a strong social sector in this country that wants to be partners. If we find the ability, and resources, when they're scarce, we got to figure out how to leverage each other's resources in order to support our children, and maybe not only leverage each other's resources, but maybe give the educators a break. And do a handoff, like teachers training others in order to come in, so that they're not the only ones that are looked at for being the educators of children. I think a lot of parents are discovering in these days of social distancing what that break might need to look like every now and again.
A lot of sympathy, right? That's social emotional development the hard way.
Exactly.
I mean, at the Urban Assembly, one of our foundational concepts is that our schools have partners. Those are partners that either are focused on career and technical education, like the Urban Assembly Harbor School, where partners come in and teach our young people specifically how to engage in marine sciences, or School for Global Commerce, but also CBOs like FIPS in Bronx, where we partner very strong with them. Just to your point, right, which is that we are a society, we are a community, and if we can think about how to bridge some of these funding gaps. I know that children's cabinets across the country have really been thinking about how to use funding effectively across social systems to make major impact. I think those are some things that we can think of as well, in terms of some models that have been useful in creating a cohesive blanket around students, so that they can experience social emotional development consistently through all the adults in their lives.
Absolutely.
So now we're thinking about this idea of community. Right. We're thinking about trust. We've talked about people who've helped you, talked about teachers. We've talked about the notion of community-based organizations. But our notion of community in our country is fragmented as well. I think some folks, on one hand, don't want to talk about values. They feel like we all have such different values that we're struggling. We will never kind of come together to come up with a cohesive sense of who we are. And the other folks think that, values are so different that we can never agree. So what is the notion of community? And what do we need to do to build community in the country right now?
Yeah, I think the definition of community, there are many different definitions. Community is where there is common interests. Community is where there is love. Community is where there is mutual support, where you can give and you can take, and everyone is doing that. Community can be place-based, but community can also be virtual. Community can be identity-based or not. And so I think the technology revolution and the internet revolution is, I think, also changing the definition of community. And there are young people that are now in global gaming communities.
Yeah, they sure are.
Yeah, it's there. I think about when I was growing up, if I went to a youth leadership conference, unless I was going to be someone's pen pal, I may never hear from those kids I met again.
True story. Yeah.
I have a little brother that's 20 years younger than me, who went to Egypt and is still in touch with the kids that he went to Egypt with. And so I think, while things get harder and while there becomes more contention in some communities, we have to expand and tap into other communities of single parents, communities of folks that are going through similar experience, communities of LGBT youth and allies, and really think about how we can use technology to build a community. I think the other thing that we have to think about, is just the polarization. And that is something that, that I worry a lot about. I started my career off serving as an intern on the Hill, working for my local congressman who was my mayor, and then became a staff assistant. And I remember when I first went to work with him in the mid 90s, he said in the mid 90s, it's not like it used to be here. It used to be you could go have a drink afterwards with the people that you might have argued with on the floor. Well, if that was the mid 90s, imagine where we are now. And I do wonder, and one of the things the Obama Foundation is so focused on, beyond the work of My Brother's Keeper, is how do you build bridges? How do you not create echo chambers where you're only listening to people that are like you? Looking at your friendship group, who aren't you friends with? Right. Who do you need to invite over to dinner? Who is that student? Who is that parent that you need to think about relationship and commonality with? Because if we keep running to our own corners, if we keep building these separate, isolated echo chambers, we're never going to be able to grow as a country and solve problems as a country. And we've got to really work on disrupting that. And it's gonna take a little give and get from everybody to get there. But that is something that we won't be able to solve problems if we can't look each other in the eye and see each other's humanity.
When you speak, it resonates with me because this notion of, we don't say making community, we say forging community, right? That
absolutely right.
Hot and it's not that comfortable. You forge iron, you forge sword.
That's right.
And just this idea of what would it take to forge community. And you talked about how do we make these connections? Who's not in our friend group? How do we deal with that uncomfortableness? And I think when we go back to this notion of social and emotional development, social and emotional development has a lot to do with how we interact with ourselves, how we interact with others, and how we solve problems. And this notion of having the ability to be uncomfortable and be flexible, I think it's a product of teaching young people and having models where they can look up to people who said it's okay to be uncomfortable, right? This is not going to feel good. But the outcome of this forging is going to be a connection that cannot be broken, right? That notion of forging is swords that can't be broken. So I appreciate that and resonate with that. And we got a couple of questions coming out of our community right now. And if you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to pull up some questions here, and we're going to see what people have to say. All right. So going into our chat. All right, so first person here is interested in how to join, or how to be part of the My Brother's Keeper. What can they do to support My Brother's Keeper?
So great. Please go, thank you for asking. Please go to obama.org/MBKA, as in My Brother's Keeper Alliance. And there you can take a look at our Get Involved page. One, you can find a listing of all My Brother's Keeper local communities that are near you. You can do a search by your city and state. And one, I would encourage you to think about what are ways that you can get involved with that local effort. On that page, you can also find a way to start your own MBK community. So there are about 250 My Brother's Keeper communities across the country. Maybe you're living in a city or a town where it doesn't exist and you want to create your own chapter. So you can find out how to do that there. Also, and obviously, constantly encourage people to thinking about mentoring. You can find mentoring opportunities that are on our webpage as well. And then, we have tons of resources and templates and tools. And so even if you don't want to go as big about thinking about how to change the trajectory of boys and young men of color for your entire city or town, you can think about how to change it for your classroom, for your place of worship, for your neighborhood, and thinking about, what are the practices that we need to advocate for, that we need to change in our own places and spaces that we're responsible for, that can make it easier for young men of color to succeed.
Outstanding. So Michael Smith is telling us that you don't have to change the entire country at once. You can find a child in your community. You can do mentorship. You can start an organization if it's not already there, but everybody can do something to support young men of color. And
let me just say, the great thing about the My Brother's Keeper communities is we aren't looking for people to start new nonprofits. All we're looking for communities to come together and say is, where are we failing our young men? Like, what is the data showing? Where are the gaps that exist? And how do we bring the community together to really double down on closing those gaps? Mm-hmm. Chances are the resources are already in your community, or they're already in your state, or they're already in the country. It's just really looking at what are the unique challenges that our young men are facing, and how do we think about doubling down on what works and getting rid of what doesn't.
Outstanding. Thank you, Michael. All right, moving to another question. This is from Michael Duvall. He says, the New York Times respirated on punishing effects of boys of color. Even if we are born into middle and upper class, we drop right back down to low income. And I think this is referring to Raj Chetty studies.
Yeah.
How can we work more collectively to elevate all incomes and backgrounds for boys and young men of color?
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, the economic angle of this is critical. And as we all know, it didn't happen by accident. It started with roots in slavery, and then there were laws and policies that have been put on the books ever since then that have kept our communities, not just young men of color, but communities of color, out of the ability to retain and create wealth. And studies have shown it would take us hundreds of years to be able to close that gap between communities of color and our white counterparts. And we continue to create policies as a country that keep our communities out. Even in the CARES Act, we're seeing some of the data on the small business loans that are coming out, where we're seeing the disproportionate impact of COVID infections and deaths, the disproportionate impact on Black and brown people who are having to work as bus operators and train workers and cleaners and restaurant workers.
Essential workers, Michael. That's the word you're looking for.
Essential workers, right? Like, no one can live without these folks, but yet somehow we're not getting the resources that have been put out there. And so, one, we've got to make sure that we keep telling the truth. My church, the old ladies used to say, tell the truth and shame the devil. You got to keep telling the truth, making sure you put the data out there to show where these disparities are, because America likes to forget. We like to quickly sweep under the rug and really think about this great American dream that's still out of the hands of so many people. And so we've got to keep telling the truth. One of the things President Obama's Council on Economic Advisors did a study that showed if you were a Black baby boy born 25 years ago, you had a 1 in 2 chance of being employed today. That's how many young men of color are out of work today. That same study, though, showed if we could close the employment rate between those young men between the ages of 16 and 54 and their white peers, we would increase GDP by 2%, over $350 billion. Mm-hmm. So the success of our young men of color is inextricably linked and inextricably tied to the success of this nation. Mm-hmm. And as we think about an economic recovery, we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of where our young men are, that they are the contract tracers, that they are the, whatever the new jobs. There will be new jobs. There will be new industries. My Facebook feed is already flooded with gadgets where you don't have to touch things. We need to make sure that our young men are on top. And we really need to think about economic pathways that starts with education, that starts with changing racist policies, like efforts like Ban the Box, and that ensures that our young folks can make it in the economic workforce.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. All right, so we have a question from Dr. Dwayne B. Thomas, and I'm just going to read the question out. I am interested in learning about practical train-the-trainer programs that are facilitating and ensuring programmatic infrastructure, program evaluation, monitoring, and assessment are maintaining and sustaining the effective use of available resources. So this seems to be like an overall question, thinking about what are the systems of trainers and training to make sure that the resources that are coming into systems are making impact on our young men of color.
Yeah, it's a big question.
It sure is.
But I would say, first of all, the work of My Brother's Keeper has always been to lead with data, first rooted in an evidence-based model, and then looking at expanding evidence-based interventions. And so we've worked with researchers. We're in the middle of a research project right now on our work. So if you look at the 19 organizations that we've invested in across the country, all of them have gone through some sort of rigorous evaluation, some randomized control trials are higher, some, more basic levels of evaluation. So I'd encourage you to look at some of those. We have an incredibly robust resources and tools section on the My Brother's Keeper Alliance website. There's also an organization called RISE for Boys and Men of Color, which is a coalition of researchers and evaluation experts that have come together around this work. I would encourage you to take a look at that. I'd encourage you to take a look at the work that's happening with New York State and My Brother's Keeper New York State, because that is run by educators, and there's an incredible rich component of the work that they do that is about training and making sure that you're moving the folks that are leading the work through rigorous training models.
I just want to emphasize what Michael is saying. Michael has spent a lot of time talking about this notion of data and grounding the work that we do in data. A lot of the work that's happening in disproportionality in schools in New York City and New York State has used data to create a conversation. And so I just wanted to reiterate the importance of having a data basis so that we can have a conversation about facts, not about opinions. So just want to pull that one more time out, because I think Michael has said that multiple times, and I think it's really important.
And David, if I could double click on that,
please.
One of the challenges when it comes to this young men of color work is there are times there's too much focus on tell those boys to pull their pants up, teach those boys how to stand up straight and, look you in the eye and have a firm handshake. And there's a lot of, frankly, toxic masculinity that's out there when you talk about boys and young men of color programming. But there's also just a lot of, we're going to build up this child and we're going to make them strong. And by making them strong, they're going to obliterate racism. And there are some elements to that. But we've got to make sure that the work that we're doing for young men of color is rooted in scientific models of what works. I think about, when I was running the Social Innovation Fund, we were looking at various models where data came in, and there had been a study of the Scared Straight programs where they would take young men who were getting into trouble, like all young men and girls do, and bring them into a correctional facility and have them meet with incarcerated individuals who would yell at them and tell them about their story, and you better do that. Not only did that not work, the program was shown to do harm to the young people that went through it. So we've got to make sure that when we're looking at the work for young men of color and all of our kids, that we don't just get into our feelings and our emotions about what worked for me. My daddy told me to stand up straight, I'm going to tell you to stand up straight. We've got to look at the science and the data about what works in order to get our kids into the pipeline. And it's not just going to be programs. It's not just going to be good programs. We also have to be changing policy and changing systems that have left too many of our young men of color behind.
Thank you so much for that. Now we're going to go to Karen McCain. Karen is interested in the most important ways to intervene with kids who are now at risk for behavior problems in these days of COVID. Let me just say that again. What are the most important ways to intervene now with kids at risk of behavior problems in these days of COVID? So in the context of not having kind of daily interaction with their young people, the kind of sustaining relationships that helps you and I move through our youth, I should say. What are some recommendations or best practices that you've seen that continue to engage these young people?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for asking it. One of the things that we have to realize, social distancing is a privilege and a luxury. Too many of our kids are underhoused, or they're going back to homes that are crowded or not always safe places. Maybe going to houses where parents are still having to work, so they're left alone. And so, sometimes you'll see young people loitering or not social distancing, and you want to get angry. But you have to understand that, COVID-19 didn't erase the systems that didn't have safety nets for our young people to begin with. And so communities are having to get creative. One, fortunately, we're seeing communities change practices about making sure that we're not over incarcerating, and that you talk to young people and help them think about safe places to go, and not, arresting young people that might be out there. We're seeing communities change, guidelines for what it means to arrest or what it means to sentence. We're seeing communities. We just had a town hall meeting with former Attorney General Eric Holder and another one with former Secretary of Education John King. And one of the things that John King said, he was talking about these Wi-Fi buses that he was seeing going to communities because kids are home all day and might not have Wi-Fi. So they were taking buses and driving them into underserved neighborhoods so kids could have Wi-Fi. Boo Milton from Baton Rouge was on that call. He's a Cities United ambassador, was at our MBK Rising conference, and was so in love with that idea that he went back to the leaders in Baton Rouge, and now they created drive-through Wi-Fi stations at parks and rec facilities throughout Baton Rouge, so people can go up in their cars and have access in a social distance way. And so I'd encourage you to go to our website, look at we've been having conversations about this, looking at cities that are beginning to think about this in a nuanced way and figuring out how we are staying connected. And a lot of nonprofits, for instance, I was listening to a story today where you've got a coach that's doing a weekly cooking class with his kids that are.
It's right up your alley there, Michael.
Yeah, it is a soccer coach. We have nonprofits that are providing gaming systems. You have nonprofits that are doing game nights online and checking in on the phone. So we're having to get creative with our young people, but encouraging folks not to think about it from a punitive standpoint, but to think about it to how do we hold up our kids during this, incredibly traumatic time.
When you say that, Mike, it reminds me, I was at a conference maybe a while back, and they had a list of things that kids were really into. And you forgive me, I don't remember what the actual list was. And I had a list of things that teachers thought kids were really into. And let's just say that list didn't really overlap, right?
Right.
And so the things you're talking about, getting on and playing NBA 2K20 with your kids, like you may, as a teacher or a nonprofit, maybe less if you're a nonprofit community organizer, may not feel like that's an actual good use of your time. But engaging with your young people in that context is a very important kind of situation in terms of feeling cared about and feeling seen. So I just want to appreciate what you're saying there, that it's small things that matter, and it may not be algebra today. Today, it may just be a touch base and seeing how you're doing in the community. So we have Nicole Haynes. I know Nicole is up in Syracuse, and Nicole really appreciates the focus on data, but she writes that I've experienced data being used to reinforce the deficit of our young Black scholars. How do we ensure a plethora of data is used from a variety of perspectives so that greatness shines through as well?
That is a great question. And we've found that data comes from all sorts of different places. It's not always going to be the MDRC study, double-blind study that, took 5 years. You have to combine the stories, you have to combine the anecdotes, but sometimes it's pre and post tests. Sometimes it's focus groups with young people that you facilitate with the nearby college students that are there. It is data, even, we're our data partners, our evaluation partners are Learning for Action and Public Equity Group, who are really taking an equity-centered lens to the evaluation, co-designing the evaluation with the communities. So we're not doing something to a community, but we're doing something with a community and an organization to prove and improve. And so fortunately, we're beginning to see a lot of change in the conversation about what data and evaluation looks like. And it is so important to lead with that mindset. And there is a difference between an equity-centered approach to data and evaluation and not. And there is a history where communities have been victimized by some of the research and evaluation that has taken place. So it's just something that has to be centered, and there are organizations out there that do it well, and there are certainly documented practices. We've also seen some really great things where we're having young people that have been put in the lead of kind of data collection efforts, where it's easier for young people to talk to other young people, them helping to design some of the survey questions, so they're not being asked not only through an adult-centered lens, but also maybe through a Eurocentric lens. So thank you for raising that up, and that is something that we're excited to see happening across the field.
Yeah, and just to your point there, Michael, at the same time, there are programs that have shown to do harm to our youth. Programs, like DARE actually showed increases in drug use. Scare Straight actually showed increases in delinquency. So while we want to be flexible in terms of incorporating many different types of voices, we also need to do what our young men deserve, and our young men deserve quality supports that have a basis of effectiveness behind them. So I wanted to just reiterate your point that you had made earlier, that things that sound good to us sometimes in our hearts and souls may not have the impact that we need them to have. And so balancing that need to create larger voices with effectiveness is something we all struggle with.
Yep. And the resources are limited, unfortunately, right? And so, one of the things that President Obama said when we created My Brother's Keeper is we're going to have bold discussions, and we're going to have to invest in things that are working, and we're going to have to stop funding things that aren't, because those are resources that can be used for effective approaches. And it might have been that your grandfather started that organization, and all the kids in your family went to that organization or were a part of this model, where the science just is showing it's not working, and we just can no longer. Our kids deserve better. And we have to have those tough conversations.
And you mentioned part of My Brother's Keeper is actually bringing together an analysis of what is actually happening in your community on behalf of young men. And part of that process helps you to kind of identify practices that are promising and practices that may need to go to the wayside. So we have one last question here that I'm going to read out from Micah. Excuse me if I didn't get your name right. And she has a small question, so we're going to do this for the ending. She wants to know how we change inequity. She's concerned about bringing resources. She knows that young men need resources, but sees that some districts just have more money, they have more technology, better programs. She wants to know if there are agencies and organizations that do outreach to our young men, but I think also wants to get a sense of just what do we do when we don't have as much as other people?
Yeah, I mean, that is a problem that our communities face. There was a New York Times article that was written this week that showed a new study that came out that showed this mass disparity between the resources that organizations that are led by Black and brown leaders have compared with their white counterparts. Sometimes to the tune of 80% less in terms of assets. And so our communities, when it comes to everything, we are often dealing with the shorter end of the stick. And so I think that's where organizations like ours come in, with My Brother's Keeper, organizations like the Black Male Engagement Network that's out there. We're seeing some, great examples with United Ways, where there are intermediary organizations that are out there that are able to shine a spotlight on what's happening in community and bring new resources that are not already there on the inside. And it's just a matter of, standing up, continuing to make it clear what the needs are and being creative about some of the partnerships. But, there are the entities that exist that are working to really try to drive those resources out. One of the new funders, for instance, Balmer Group, was talking to Jeff Edmondson, who is a senior executive there who used to run the Strive Network. And Jeff said, I don't like public grant competitions because we already know where the need is. And if you look at where philanthropic resources goes, it's always to the places, where the need is less. And so fortunately, we're beginning to see a mind shift in some of those entities and some of those funders that I hope are beginning to benefit our community. But it is not an easy road. It's also knowing your talents, right? And so some of the best things that I've seen is there was someone that has the program talent, the curriculum talent, but they had a friend who is an expert at fundraising, who is, doing this as a part-time. That's why collective impact has been so important. We're seeing communities across the country where they say, all right, Chamber of Commerce, you come to the table. All right, biggest employer in our community, you come to the table because you're going to need people to fill these jobs. And now you're responsible for the piece of this work that is getting funding for this workforce training program. So solutions like that we're seeing are starting to see some shifts for the resource allocation.
That's a great point. That is really something to be thinking about in terms of how we access these different resources in different places. All right, so we got a quick shout out here from My Brother's Keeper, Charlotte Mecklenburg, who is a lead partner with Race Matters for Juvenile Justice. They're co-creating with young people to advocate transformative policy shift around the court system and racial equity. We got a shout out here from Cynthia for your local chapter of NAACP, who can be a great source of mentors for young people in your community, especially people of color. And then we got an agreement here around Don Thomas in terms of systems approaches and facilitating collective impact. I just wanted to thank you, Michael, so much for taking the time out today to talk about social emotional development in the community. Your inspiring story and the work that you've done is broadening the notion of what it means to be in community for young people and young men of color across our country. And so I want to just give you the last couple of minutes here to give us a farewell thank you, and then we're going to call it a day for our webinar.
David, thank you. Thank you, Urban Assembly. Thanks to my brother and former White House colleague, Kevin Beckford, who made this connection and allowed me to be here today. And just thank you to all the educators and all the people that are in the lives of our children, especially during these times. You go above and beyond every day, but we're just seeing the extraordinary value. You make dreams happen. You are that bridge over troubled water, and it's my privilege to have an opportunity to connect with you. And on behalf of Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, I say thank you, and we'll continue to have your backs at the Obama Foundation and My Brother's Keeper Alliance.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for our audience members. This is our first series in SEL in the community. Michael Smith is the Executive Director of My Brother's Keepers Alliance. We thank him for taking the time out to speak with us today. Have a wonderful day, and happy Teacher Education Week to all of our teachers in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you.